The morning began like any other in the quiet settlement of Aralith. The twin suns rose together in a pale orange sky, casting their warm light across the wide grass fields that surrounded the town. The air was calm, filled with the scent of flowering vines that clung to the stone walls. People went about their daily work repairing tools, tending to the crops, or trading goods in the small market square. Lyra stood on the wooden balcony outside her workshop, wiping her hands on a cloth after adjusting a broken power coil. She enjoyed mornings like this, when the world felt safe and unchanging. But that peace ended in the next heartbeat. A sudden roar ripped across the sky, not like the low hum of a transport ship or the gentle whisper of wind, but a tearing violent sound that shook the air itself. Lyra's head snapped upward. In the bright expanse above, she saw a burning shape cut through the clouds like a falling star. The object spun wildly, leaving a trail of black smoke that spiraled in its wake. The sound grew louder, sharper, until she could feel it rumbling in her chest. People in the square stopped what they were doing and stared upward. A child pointed and shouted, but the words were lost in the deafening noise. Lyra's heart raced as she realized the falling object was heading straight toward the fields beyond the settlement. She had seen meteors before, but this was different. This was metal, a ship, a small one. Her mind raced through possibilities: damaged cargo craft, a patrol vessel, or maybe an escape pod. Whatever it was in serious trouble. She didn't stop to think further. She ran down the steps of her workshop, grabbing her tool satchel on the way, and sprinted toward the outer fields. Dust rose behind her boots as she pushed her legs harder, weaving between startled farmers who had abandoned their work to watch. The descent. The burning craft struck the ground with a blinding flash and a deep, shuddering boom. The earth trembled under her feet. A wave of heat and smoke rolled over the field. Pieces of scorched metal scattered across the tall grass, some still glowing red from the impact. Lyra coughed and waved the smoke away as she approached the wreck. Her sharp eyes traced the twisted hull. It was definitely a pod, the kind used for emergency evacuation from larger ships. The surface was charred almost black, but she could make out symbols she didn't recognize. A jagged hole had been torn open on one side, and through it she saw movement. She climbed up the cracked metal, ignoring the sting of heat, and looked inside. There, strapped into a half-melted seat, was a human. She had never seen one in person, only in grainy news images from faraway systems. His face was pale beneath streaks of soot and blood. His eyes were half open, unfocused, as if he was drifting between worlds. His breaths were shallow and ragged. In his hands he clutched a small metal shard, no bigger than a data drive, but unlike any device she had seen. It pulsed faintly with blue light, even through the smoke. Lyra leaned closer, her voice steady but urgent. "Can you hear me?" She didn't know if he understood her language, but his eyes shifted slightly in her direction. His lips moved, and she caught fragments of words. "They're coming, don't let them take it." Then his head fell back, and he lost consciousness. She quickly unfastened the cracked restraints and lifted him out of the pod. He was heavier than he looked, the weight of armor plates hidden under his torn uniform pressing against her arms. But she carried him over her shoulder. The shard was still in his grasp, and she made no attempt to take it from him. The distant sound of engines reached her ears. She froze, glancing toward the sky. In the high atmosphere, 3 dark shapes moved in formation, their silver hulls reflecting the light of the suns. They were warships, and even from here she recognized the angular design. Dominion craft. Her breath tightened. The Dominion was not supposed to be anywhere near Aralith. This was a quiet frontier far from their patrol routes. But if they were here now, and the human's words were true, they were already looking for him. Lyra hurried across the fields, keeping low among the tall grass. She knew every path and shortcut to the edge of town, where her workshop sat half hidden behind rows of storage sheds. The engines in the sky grew louder and more distinct. She could see the patrol dropships breaking from the main formation, heading down toward the settlement. She clenched her jaw and quickened her pace. If the Dominion landed here, they would search every home and building until they found what they wanted. And she had no doubt they would kill anyone who stood in their way. When she reached the workshop, she kicked the door shut behind her and lowered the human onto a padded workbench. His chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm, and his skin was burning with fever. She pulled a coolant pack from her satchel and pressed it against his forehead, then began removing the damaged armor plates so she could treat the wounds beneath. Some were burns, others deep cuts from shrapnel. She worked quickly, cleaning and sealing each injury with the med gel she kept for emergencies. The shard he held never left his grip. Even in unconsciousness, his fingers curled protectively around it. The thrum of engines outside grew into the harsh whine of landing thrusters. Through a small side window, Lyra saw the silver shapes of Dominion patrol ships settling in the square. Soldiers in black armor poured out, their weapons gleaming under the light. A voice boomed over an amplifier, ordering all citizens to remain in place and submit to inspection. Lyra's heart pounded, but her hand stayed steady as she finished. Wrapping the last wound, she looked down at the stranger. He had fallen into her life without warning, crashing through the peace she had known. And yet she felt a fierce certainty building inside her. She could hear the soldiers moving closer, their boots striking the stone streets. The human had said they were coming. He was right. And if they found him here, they would take him away. Lyra glanced at the shard glowing faintly in his grasp. She didn't know what it contained or why it was worth the risk of chasing him across the stars. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. They were not going to touch him. Not while she was still breathing. The pounding of heavy boots echoed through the streets outside as Dominion soldiers spread out from the landing zone. The sound of their sharp commands mixed with the low hum of the patrol ships that hovered just above the rooftops. From her workshop window, Lyra saw them moving in groups of 3, their black armor plates reflecting the sun's light and cold. Metallic glints. Each carried a rifle slung low and a scanner unit strapped to their wrist. They were looking for something, and she knew exactly what it was. The soldiers were not here for trade or inspection. They were here for the human. She turned back to him lying unconscious on the bench. His breathing had steadied slightly under her treatment, but he was still pale and weak. The small shard in his hand continued to pulse faintly as though it had a heartbeat of its own. Lyra had worked with every kind of machine and power cell on Aerolith, yet nothing she knew matched the quiet energy flowing from that device. The Dominion wanted him for a reason, and that reason was locked in his grasp. She reached for the shard, but his fingers tightened even in his sleep as if he sensed her touch. She pulled back and decided she would not take it from him. Whatever it was, it belonged with him. Through the thin walls she could hear the voices of her neighbors being questioned. Dominion soldiers were going door to door. Their tone was cold and clipped. "Where is the off-worlder? Have you seen it crash?" No one in the settlement would dare to lie to the Dominion for fear of punishment. But they might not have seen her slip across the fields carrying him. She had minutes at most before the soldiers reached her workshop. Lyra thought fast. She needed a place to hide him. The main floor was too exposed, and the basement was used for storing heavy coils and scrap, so there was no space there. Then her eyes fell on the trapdoor hidden beneath an old floor mat in the back corner. Years ago she had built a concealed compartment for smuggling small tools and banned tech past the customs inspectors. It was narrow and dark, but it could fit one person if necessary. She hurried to open it and tested the air inside. Dry and safe. It would work for now. She returned to the bench and shook him gently. His eyes fluttered open, still hazy but focused enough to see her face. She spoke in a low voice, urging him to stand. He tried but winced in pain and nearly collapsed again. Wrapping her arm around his waist, she guided him to the trapdoor and helped him lower himself inside. His movements were slow but deliberate, as though he understood the danger. She told him to stay quiet no matter what happened and to trust her. He nodded faintly before the hatch closed over him, sealing him in darkness that no sooner had she moved back to the workbench to make it look busy than a heavy knock rattled the door. 3 armored figures stood there, their visors reflecting her own face back at her. One stepped forward and announced in a voice that carried no warmth that they were conducting an urgent inspection. She forced a calm expression and asked what they were looking for. The soldier's scanner beeped softly as he swept it across the room. He said they were seeking an off-worlder who had fallen from orbit and that this person carried dangerous, stolen property. She replied that she had been working all morning and had seen no such person. The soldier studied her for a long moment before stepping inside. The 3 spread out, examining every corner of the workshop. One lifted the covers off her tool racks. Another checked behind the storage crates. The one with the scanner walked slowly toward the back corner where the trapdoor lay hidden beneath the mat. Lyra's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to keep working on the broken coil at her bench. The scanner's beeping grew louder, and she knew it was reacting to the faint energy of the shard below. She picked up a heavy wrench and accidentally let it slip from her hand with a loud clang. The noise startled the soldier, and he turned his head toward her. She pretended to struggle with the coil, muttering about how difficult it was to repair. With all the noise outside, the moment's distraction was enough for the scanner to pass over the mat without the soldier paying close attention. The beeping faded. After several more minutes, the lead soldier declared the place clear. He warned her to report immediately if she saw or heard anything unusual. She nodded and watched as they left, their boots thudding back toward the street. Only when their voices had faded into the distance did she kneel and open the trapdoor. The human looked up at her, his eyes sharper now though his face was still pale. She told him it was safe for the moment and helped him out. Once he was back on the bench, she asked his name. He hesitated as if weighing the risk, but then answered softly. Kane. She repeated it to make sure she understood. He told her he had been part of a human fleet stationed far from this region when the Dominion launched a surprise attack. His ship had been destroyed, and he had escaped in the pod with the shard. The device, he explained, was more than just stolen property. It contained the location of a hidden human fleet regrouping for a counterstrike. If the Dominion captured it, they would destroy that fleet before it could even move. Lyra listened in silence, understanding the weight of what he carried. If she handed him over, the Dominion might spare her life, but she would be giving them the power to crush his people completely. She had seen the Dominion's cruelty before in other systems. They would not stop until they owned everything and everyone. She told Kane that she would not give him up. He looked at her with disbelief, as if such loyalty from a stranger was beyond his understanding. Outside, the sounds of search parties continued. More ships were landing. Lyra knew they could not hide here for long. She began packing supplies into a small bag: food, water, medical gear, and a few of her best tools. Kane tried to stand, but she pushed him gently back, telling him to save his strength. She had a plan. There was an old smuggler she knew who owed her a favor. He had a ship hidden in the canyon beyond the northern ridge. If they could reach him, he might be able to get them both off-world. Kane warned that the Dominion would have blocked all easy routes out of the settlement. Lyra replied that there were tunnels beneath the old waterworks leading to the ridge. They were dangerous and half-collapsed in places, but she knew every twist and turn. If they moved quickly, they might reach the canyon before the Dominion realized they were gone. She helped Kane to his feet again, this time supporting more of his weight as they moved toward the rear exit of the workshop. The twin suns were sinking, lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the narrow streets. Dominion patrols were still sweeping through the town, but Lyra kept to the alleys and hidden paths. Each step took them farther from the workshop and closer to the tunnels. She could feel the tension building like a storm on the horizon. One mistake, one sound too loud, and the soldiers would be on them. Kane glanced at her as they moved, his voice low and strained. He asked why she was risking her life for him. She thought about it for a moment, and then answered simply that sometimes a person appears in your life, and you know you cannot let them be taken, no matter the cost. Kane said nothing, but she saw something change in his eyes, a spark of trust. Where before there had only been guarded suspicion. They reached the old waterworks entrance just as the last light of the suns began to fade. Lyra guided him inside, her hand steady on his arm. Behind them the settlement lay quiet under the watch of Dominion ships, but ahead in the dark tunnels there was still a chance of escape. She knew the real danger was only beginning, the tunnels. Beneath the old waterworks were cold and damp, the air heavy with the smell of rust and stone. Lyra guided Kane forward, her small lantern casting long shifting shadows across the curved walls. The light flickered whenever it touched the pools of water that had gathered on the cracked floor. Kane moved slowly, his weight leaning against her shoulder, but his steps were steady enough to keep going. Every now and then he would glance back, as if expecting Dominion soldiers to burst through the darkness at any moment. Lyra understood that feeling all too well, because she could sense the same danger pressing in from behind. She knew the tunnels better than most. When she had been younger, she had explored them for scraps of old machinery and wiring left over from when the waterworks still supplied the settlement. Now they were abandoned, half-flooded in places, and in some sections the ceiling had collapsed entirely. Few people dared to come here anymore, which made them the perfect route to escape. Unseen, but the Dominion was not easily fooled. Lyra kept her ears sharp for the distant hum of scanners or the metallic echo of boots. As they moved deeper, Kane began to speak in a quiet voice, his words broken by short breaths. He told her about the battle in space, about how his ship had been surrounded and how the captain had ordered him to take the shard and flee. Lyra could hear the weight of loss in his tone as he spoke of his crew. She did not interrupt, letting him talk because she knew sometimes the only way to keep moving through fear was to let the words out. They came to a section where the tunnel sloped downward sharply and the water reached up to their knees. The cold made Kane shiver, but he pressed on without complaint. Lyra kept her lantern high and scanned for the faint markings on the wall that told her where the side passages branched off. Somewhere above them, in the streets of Aralith, Dominion patrols were likely closing in. The longer they stayed underground, the more dangerous it became. Yet turning back was no longer an option. Halfway through the flooded section, Lyra stopped suddenly. She thought she heard something in the distance behind them, a faint mechanical buzz that did not belong to the natural sounds of dripping water and shifting stone. Kane froze beside her and listened. The sound grew clearer, a rhythmic pulse followed by a thin whine. It was a Dominion scout drone. The machines were small but fast, equipped with light scanners and tracking sensors. If one spotted them, it would alert the soldiers immediately. Lyra quickened her pace, urging Kane forward. The tunnel curved left, and she knew of a side passage ahead that could lead them to higher ground where the drone scanners might not reach. They splashed through the cold water, the sound of their movements echoing in the enclosed space. The drone's buzzing grew louder, now mixed with the faint glow of its search beam flashing against the far wall. Reaching the side passage, Lyra pulled Kane inside, just as the beam swept past the main tunnel. They pressed against the wall, holding their breath. The drone's hum passed by slowly, its sensors searching for movement. For a tense moment, Lyra feared it might detect the faint heat of their bodies, but then the sound faded as it moved further down the main path. She exhaled in relief and motioned for Kane to follow her again. The side passage was narrower, forcing them to walk single file. The walls here were rougher, carved more by erosion than design, and the floor was uneven with loose stones. Lyra moved ahead, using her memory to navigate the twists and turns. She had been down this path once before when she was younger, but never in such dire circumstances. She kept thinking of the smuggler waiting in the canyon beyond the ridge. If they could just reach him, they would have a chance to get off-world before the Dominion closed the net entirely. After several minutes, they emerged into a wider chamber where the ceiling rose high above them. Shafts of faint light filtered through cracks in the stone, showing that they were closer to the surface now. Kane paused to catch his breath, and Lyra took the opportunity to check the small scanner she had brought from her workshop. It was old, but still worked well enough to detect large heat signatures. The display showed 2 signals moving toward their position from the direction they had come. That meant the drone had likely picked up something, after all, and now soldiers. "We're on their trail," Lyra urged Kane onward again, this time faster. They moved toward the far end of the chamber, where another tunnel sloped upward. The climb was steep and Kane's injury slowed them, but he pushed himself harder, his jaw set with determination. As they neared the top of the slope, a loud metallic crash echoed from behind them. Lyra glanced back and saw a figure in black armor entering the chamber. The soldier raised a rifle and shouted, the words bouncing harshly off the stone walls. Without thinking, Lyra pulled Kane into the upper tunnel and they ran, the sound of shots ringing out as energy bolts struck the stone around them. Sparks flew and the air filled with the acrid smell of burnt rock. Kane stumbled, but Lyra caught him and dragged him forward, her own breath coming hard now. She could hear the soldier's boots pounding against the floor and knew that more would be close behind. The tunnel opened suddenly into a narrow fissure in the rock, and ahead Lyra could see daylight spilling through a jagged opening. She urged Kane toward it with every bit of strength she had left. The sunlight grew brighter as they reached the end, and with one final push they emerged into the open air of the northern ridge. The sky above was beginning to darken with the onset of night, but the view stretched far across the rocky canyons below. Somewhere down there was the smuggler's hidden landing site. There was no time to rest. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was growing louder. Dominion soldiers were climbing through the fissure. Lyra pulled Kane toward a narrow path that wound along the ridge, its edge dropping sharply into the canyon. The wind here was strong, carrying the smell of dust and stone. Kane's grip tightened on the shard as they moved as they hurried along. The path, a Dominion dropship, swept into view from the far side of the ridge, its engines thundering in the thin air. Searchlights cut across the rocks, sweeping toward their position. Lyra knew they would be exposed within seconds. She spotted a cluster of boulders ahead that might offer cover and guided Kane toward them. The searchlights passed over the path. Just as they ducked behind the rocks, the dropship's shadow looming over them like a predator. Kane's breathing was harsh and uneven, but his eyes were steady now, focused on the canyon below. Lyra followed his gaze and saw a faint light flicker in the distance. 3 short pulses. It was a signal. The smuggler had seen them. Relief surged through her, but was quickly tempered by the sound of Dominion soldiers closing in. The next stretch would be the most dangerous yet. Lyra looked at Kane and said they had to move fast and without hesitation. If they slowed now, the Dominion would cut them off before they reached the canyon floor. Kane nodded and tightened his grip on her arm for balance. Together they slipped from behind the rocks and began the final descent toward the light in the canyon, their footsteps echoing in the gathering darkness while the enemy closed in from above. The path into the canyon was steep and rough, with loose stones sliding under their boots as they descended. Lyra kept one arm locked around Kane's waist to steady him while her other hand gripped the jagged edge of the rock wall for balance. The smuggler's signal light flashed again from far below, but so did the bright glare of Dominion search. Beams sweeping across the canyon walls. The enemy was coming from above and from behind, forcing them to move faster than Kane's wounded body could handle. She could feel his weight leaning heavier on her, yet he did not complain, his determination carrying him forward step after step. They reached a narrow ledge where the canyon floor widened into a flat stretch scattered with rusting machinery. This place had once been a mining outpost before the Dominion took control of the surrounding systems. Now it lay abandoned, the old refinery at its center standing like a skeleton of metal and shadow. Lyra knew its walls would provide cover, and its old storage rooms might buy them precious minutes before the Dominion reached them. She guided Kane through the twisted metal gates into the refinery's silent halls. Inside, the air was cooler, but thick with the scent of oil and dust. Shafts of moonlight fell through the holes in the ceiling, glinting off pools of stagnant water on the floor. Lyra found a small corner where Kane could sit with his back against the wall. She crouched beside him, her hands already moving to check his wounds. The bandages from earlier were soaked with sweat and dirt. He tried to push her hands away, insisting she save her strength, but she ignored him. She could see the strain in his face and hear the rough edge in his breathing. The faint hum of engines grew louder outside. The Dominion dropship had found the canyon floor. Lyra stood and moved quickly through the shadows, scanning the walls and floor for anything she could use. Old fuel canisters still sat stacked in the corners, their surfaces rusted, but some heavy enough to suggest they were not empty. She dragged a few toward the entrance and began setting them in places where they could block the path or collapse a section of the ceiling. Her mind moved with the precision of an engineer and the urgency of someone who had nothing left to lose. She had defended her home from thieves before, but this time the stakes were far greater. Kane watched her work and finally asked why she was doing this. She stopped for only a moment, meeting his gaze in the pale light. Because you fell into my life and I will not let them take you. He seemed ready to argue, but whatever he saw in her eyes made him stay silent. She went back to work, setting up tripwires using spare wiring from the broken machinery, and arranging sharp metal shards where boots would step. Every movement was quick and deliberate, her mind already picturing the coming fight. The first sound of Dominion boots echoed through the refinery soon after. Their voices were low and sharp, communicating positions as they spread out. Lyra could tell there were at least 6 soldiers from the pattern of their movements. She crouched behind a rusted support beam, holding a length of pipe she had fashioned into a weapon. When the first soldier stepped over the tripwire, the canister above toppled and exploded in a burst of flame and shrapnel, sending him crashing to the floor. The others shouted orders and the room filled with the whine of energy rifles. Kane tried to rise, but she signaled for him to stay hidden. He still clutched the shard, holding it close to his chest. The Dominion would not hesitate to kill him for it, and she could not allow that. She moved through the shadows, striking fast and vanishing before the soldiers could lock onto her position. One fell when she slammed the pipe into his helmet, another when she cut the power to his weapon with a quick twist of her tools. Yet for each one she disabled, more seemed to press in through the refinery doors. The Dominion commander's voice cut through the chaos, cold and certain. "Bring me the human alive. Kill the other." The words sent a surge of heat through Lyra's chest. She refused to be reduced to the other. She would not be a shadow in someone else's hunt. She stepped into the open, her eyes fixed on the tall, armored figure striding toward her. The commander's rifle swung up, but she hurled a fuel canister at his feet and fired a small burst from her welding torch. The resulting blast shook the walls, throwing both of them back. Pain jolted through her side where a piece of debris struck her, but she forced herself up. The commander rose too, his armor scorched but intact. He advanced with a blade drawn now, moving with the confidence of someone who had never been beaten in close combat. Lyra met him head-on. The fight was fast and brutal, the clang of metal against metal ringing in the air. He was stronger, but she was faster and far more desperate. Every strike she made was driven by the thought of Cain behind her, by the memory of his words about the hidden fleet, and by the fire that had grown inside her since the moment she had pulled him from that wreck dot. At last she found an opening. She feinted left, then drove the pipe hard into the joint of his armor at the neck. The commander staggered, but his blade slashed across her arm, drawing blood. She ignored the pain, stepping in close to wrench the blade from his grasp and drive it deep into the gap in his chest plate. His eyes widened in shock before he fell heavily to the ground. The remaining Dominion soldiers hesitated at the sight of their commander falling. That moment was all she needed. She shouted for Cain, and together they moved toward the far exit of the refinery, where a narrow path led deeper into the canyon. The smuggler's light was brighter now, a steady beacon, calling them forward. Behind them, the refinery smoldered with the remnants of her traps, the air thick with smoke and the echo of battle. Lyra's injured arm throbbed with each step, but she kept moving. Cain stayed close beside her, his face set with grim determination. The shard was still in his hand, its faint glow lighting the path ahead. They had survived the stand, but she knew the Dominion was not finished. They would regroup and follow. The only question was whether they could reach the smuggler before the next wave closed in. The canyon air grew colder as night deepened, the wind whispering through the narrow stone walls as Lyra and Cain pushed forward. The smuggler's light flickered steadily in the distance, marking the final stretch of their desperate journey. Lyra's arm burned from the cut she had taken in the refinery, but she kept her pace steady, knowing that slowing down now could mean being trapped. Cain's steps were uneven and heavy, yet his grip on the shard never loosened. The faint blue glow from the device seemed to guide them, its light catching on the jagged rocks as they moved. They reached a bend in the canyon where the path widened into a small clearing surrounded by high walls. There, half hidden under a camouflage tarp, was the smuggler's ship, an old freighter with patched hull plates and mismatched engines. The smuggler himself stepped from the shadows as they approached. He was a tall, wiry man with a weathered face and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Lyra had known him for years, and though she trusted him more than most, she still watched for any sign that he might turn them in for the right price. He took one look at Cain, then at the glowing shard in his hand, and his expression grew serious. Lyra quickly explained that the Dominion was closing in, that they needed to be off-world immediately. The smuggler did not waste time with questions. He signaled for them to follow and led them toward the ship's rear ramp. The interior smelled of engine grease and metal, the walls lined with crates secured by straps. Cain eased himself into one of the seats near the cockpit while Lyra moved to help the smuggler prepare for takeoff. The engines rumbled to life, a deep vibration running through the floor as the ship's systems came online. Before they could lift off, the faint hum of approaching dropships reached their ears. The smuggler cursed under his breath and increased the engine power. Lyra glanced through the narrow cockpit window and saw the Dominion ships entering the canyon from both directions, their searchlights sweeping across the rock walls. The smuggler took the ship up fast, skimming just above the canyon floor before angling sharply toward the open sky. Beams of energy fire lanced past them, striking the rocks and sending showers of debris into the air. The freighter shuddered as one of the shots grazed its hull, but the smuggler kept climbing. Dominion fighters broke away from the dropships and streaked toward them, their weapons flashing in the darkness. Lyra strapped herself into the co-pilot's seat and scanned the console for the defense controls. The ship was not built for combat, but it had a few countermeasures. She activated the flare launchers, sending bursts of bright light to confuse the enemy targeting systems. Kane, still pale but alert, called out warnings whenever he spotted a fighter moving in from the side. They broke free of the canyon and into the open sky, the stars stretching above them like a vast ocean of light. The Dominion fighters stayed close behind, their formation tight. Lyra knew they would not stop until Kane and the shard were in their hands. She asked the smuggler how far they were from a safe jump point. He replied that they needed another minute to clear the gravity well of the planet. That minute felt like an eternity. The fighters opened fire again, and one of the shots struck the freighter's rear engine. Alarms blared as the ship's systems flickered. The smuggler fought to keep control, his hands steady on the controls despite the shaking. Lyra's mind raced. If they lost speed now, the Dominion would board them before they could escape. She remembered the emergency thrusters mounted on the underside of the hull, a last resort system meant for short bursts. She switched control to manual and triggered them. The ship lurched forward, the sudden acceleration pressing them back in their seats. The extra speed carried them past the edge of the gravity well. The smuggler shouted that they were clear. Lyra glanced at Kane, who held the shard tightly, and he nodded once. The smuggler activated the jump drive, and the stars outside stretched into lines as the freighter leapt into hyperspace. The sudden silence was almost overwhelming after the chaos of the chase. Only the low hum of the ship's systems remained. Lyra unstrapped herself and moved to check on Kane. He was exhausted but still awake, his eyes fixed on the shard in his hand. He told her that now he could send its data to the hidden human fleet. It would allow them to regroup and strike back against the Dominion, turning the tide of the war. Lyra listened quietly as he spoke, feeling the weight of everything they had been through in such a short time. She realized she had never once thought of leaving him behind, not when she had first seen him in the wreckage, not when the soldiers had searched her workshop, and not during the fight in the refinery. Somewhere along the way, protecting him had become more than a choice. It was a promise she would not break. Kane reached for her hand and thanked her, his voice low but steady. He said she had saved not only his life, but the lives of countless others who would now have a chance to fight for their freedom. She shook her head and told him it was not about his people or their war, it was about him. He had fallen into her life, and she would destroy anyone who tried to take him away. For a moment, there was no sound between them except the hum of the ship and the distant rhythm of the engines. The smuggler called from the cockpit that they had a clear path to the rendezvous point. Kane activated the shard, and a holographic projection filled the cabin with the image of distant stars and fleet coordinates. A secure transmission pulsed away into the dark, carrying hope to a hidden corner of the galaxy. Lyra watched the light fade and knew the fight against the Dominion was far from over. But for now, Kane was safe, and that was enough. She stood by the window, looking out at the endless sweep of hyperspace. Somewhere behind them, the Dominion would already be planning their next move. Somewhere ahead, there would be more battles to fight, but she was ready. She had faced their soldiers, their commander, their relentless pursuit, and she had not backed down. She would do it again if she had to. Kane leaned back in his seat, his eyes closing at last as exhaustion claimed him. The shard rested in his lap, its glow fading to a soft, steady pulse. Lyra stayed beside him, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. She thought of the moment she had first seen him, broken and half-conscious in the wreckage, and how something inside her had decided in that instant that he was worth any risk. That feeling had not changed. It would never change. The smuggler's voice came again, saying they would reach a safe harbor within the hour. Lyra allowed herself to relax for the first time since the crash. Outside, the stars streamed endlessly. By each one a promise of another place, another story. She knew theirs was only beginning, but whatever came next, they would face it together. The end.